Hey kids, History Channel guy here. So, Robert E. Lee is probably one of the most controversial figures in world history. Some see General Lee as an exemplary example of a Southern gentleman, while others see him as a villain who led the army attempting to preserve the institution of slavery. Frankly, I was scared to do this video, but my viewership numbers haven't been awesome lately. Remember to like and subscribe, of course, so I finally caved in. Please be kind in the comment sections, but as you can read by the title, I will be defending Robert E. Lee. Oh boy, I'm gonna lose like half my subscribers for this one. Part 1. Lee and Slavery. Like many of my historical figures that I've went over previously, the first question I'm going to go over is the slavery question. I've heard from many people who defend Lee that Lee was a staunch abolitionist who despised slavery. They often cite the Lee quote, and I quote, "In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country." Yet they fail to mention the rest of Lee's quote, which states, "I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly elicited in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more stronger for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy." Yikes. Lee further goes on to say, although the abolitionist must know this, and must see that he has neither the right or the power of operating except for by moral means and suasion. And if he means well to the slave, he must not create angry feelings in the master. In other words, Lee saw slavery as an evil institution, but it was not in the classical abolitionist all men are created equal reason. His reasoning was it was a great burden on white slave owners of what to do with this, lack of a better word, inferior race. Moreover, Lee also exhibited the extremely warped view of slaves being better off enslaved here than on their own in Africa. Lee and other Southerners often justified this belief with the story of Ham. According to the book of Genesis, Noah, of Noah's Ark of course, cursed his son Ham's descendants for dishonoring him. According to the scripture, Noah gave his son's descendants dark skin and said that they would be slaves as punishment for his son's insolence. Keep in mind that Annabelle himself was deeply religious, meaning they did in many ways still consider the Bible to be infallible. The curse of Ham gave white Southerners the biblical justification for blacks being enslaved, basically saying God put these people here to be enslaved. Therefore, all their actions are morally justified because they're God's will. The curse of Ham is present in Lee's quote, and it's present in almost every Southern slave owner at the time. Also, for some reason, there's this myth that Lee did not own slaves at all. Often, lost causers like to cite a random Facebook meme that says Grant was a slave owner and Lee wasn't, which, if you watch my In Defense of Grant video, you would know cannot be further from the truth. In 1829, after Lee's mother died, he inherited 4 families of enslaved people from her. Moreover, before the Civil War, Lee became the executor of his father-in-law George Custis's estate, who, interestingly enough, was the step-grandson of George Washington. And Custis's estate included over 200 enslaved people. What makes matters worse is, according to Custis's will, all slaves were to be freed after his death, after no more than 5 years. In fact, according to some accounts, Custis wanted his slaves freed immediately, but historians still debate the legitimacy of those claims. However, according to a letter written by the New York Times, the heirs to the Custis' estate were intentionally delaying the emancipation of his slaves due to financial reasons. What sucks for Lee's legacy is this claim kinda has some proof in reality, considering over the next few years, Lee twice asked the state courts to extend the 5-year deadline because he was concerned Custis left his heirs with way too much debt, and the only way to pay it off was via slavery. Though technically Lee did not own any of these slaves, he was still responsible for overseeing them, and by most accounts, Lee was an incredibly harsh master. During a 2-year leave from his military career, Lee would lease out his slaves to other plantations deeper south, which separated dozens of families. But this was not an uncommon practice for slaveholders at the time, so I think we need to keep that in mind. But at the same time, Custis wanted these slaves freed, but instead, Lee took it upon himself to lease them further south. Another horrible instance of Lee showing his harshness as a slave owner involves the Norris case. In 1859, 3 Arlington slaves fled and were captured near Pennsylvania. In 1859, the anti-slavery newspaper, the New York Daily Tribune, published a piece claiming that Lee had the Norrises whipped. Apparently, Lee went as far as to personally whip the mother slave, despite her overseer refusing to. After the war, Wesley Norris claimed that General Lee told him that, and I quote, "he would teach us a lesson we would not soon forget." After the incident, Lee was said to punish the slaves by sending them to alternative plantations deeper south, one of which was Alabama. Yikes. Don't want to be in Alabama ever. Despite how awful this sounds, many historians have disputed Lee's involvement with the Norrises. Though it is agreed upon that Lee had the slaves recaptured and sent further south as punishment, many believe that Lee did not personally whip any of the Norrises' slaves. According to the 1930s Lee historian Douglas S. Freeman, he quotes, "There's no evidence, direct or indirect, that Lee had them or any other Negroes flogged. The usage at Arlington and elsewhere in Virginia among people of Lee's station forbade such a thing." Yet, according to Michael Fellman, in The Making of Robert E. Lee, Fellman claimed that it was unlikely that Lee personally whipped the Norrises, but it's probable that he ordered them to be whipped by an overseer because he considered corporal punishment as an essential part of disciplining slaves. So did Lee whip the Norrises and other slaves? Honestly, I have no idea considering there is so much contradictory information about it, yet without a doubt Lee owned slaves and believed that they were inferior to whites. "But History Channel guy, my grandpappy told me Lee was an abolitionist. He stated that he detested slavery on multiple occasions." Okay, well, I kind of already went over Lee's original quote involving slavery, but why not dig a bit deeper into Lee's views on race relations in the United States? I do think it should be noted that many historians believe that Lee was against the institution of slavery. Heck, even some Ivy League professors, such as Eric Foner of Columbia University, wrote about how Lee saw slavery as an evil institution. But this by no way means that Lee was an abolitionist. And frankly, most of you would consider Lee a white supremacist by our modern day standards. Lee, for instance, thought that the blacks benefited from slavery because of the will of God on whether or not they should be freed. Lee's father-in-law was also a member of the American Colonization Society, which, as I went over in my Lincoln video, was a pretty progressive organization for their time. Lee did help some of his former slaves gain their freedom in Liberia and actually helped fund their expeditions. And honestly, I have nothing bad to say about this regarding Lee and the American Colonization Society. It would be hypocritical of me not to criticize Lincoln for it and criticize Lee. I do have to applaud that Lee was a proponent of gradual emancipation as well. This meant that slavery should be ended slowly and over decades, and not overnight, that many abolitionists wanted. To Lee, he believed that overnight abolition could lead to a civil war, and in a weird way, he was kinda right. After the election of Abraham Lincoln, slave states were worried that Lincoln would get rid of slavery, despite the president's constant pleas that he was not going to end it. In reality, these Southerners were more ticked off that Lincoln would allow for the expansion of slavery, but that is a story for another day. Anyway, back to Lee. Despite Lee on the surface exhibiting better characteristics regarding slavery than his Southern counterparts, he did have a sinister undertone about him. As Professor Eric Foner, the same guy from Columbia University, wrote, quote, "Lee was not a pro-slavery ideologue, but I think equally important is that unlike many white Southerners, he never spoke out against slavery. I disagree on one aspect of that quote. I don't think it was many white Southerners. I would say it was some, but I digress. Moreover, Foner goes on to say how Lee quotes, judged the experience of white mastery to be a great moral evil to the white man than the black suffering under the painful discipline of slavery, which introduced Christianity, literacy, and a work ethic to the heathen African. Yep, he called slaves heathen Africans. Not great. Okay, not a good look, General. So, was Lee a staunch abolitionist like many lost causers like to say? Hell no, not even close. I get it, y'all. Lee was a very quiet man, and he really rarely talked about his personal feelings because as a military man, he believed partisanship should not get in the way of your duty. But if you don't believe me, just keep in mind, in the election of 1860, Lee voted for John C. Breckinridge, an extremely pro-slavery candidate, instead of John Bell, a moderate from his home state of Virginia. I'm just saying, he literally fought for Virginia, so you'd think that he would go for the moderate if he didn't like slavery so much. Part 2. Lee in Wartime. For this section, I thought about going over Lee's wartime tactics, but honestly, other YouTubers have done that better than I could, and considering I'm not a military historian, I believe I should just go over Lee's moral actions during the war. To start off, we have heard the story of General Lee famously declining to fight for the Union Army because he would have to take up arms against his home state of Virginia. And honestly, I love this story, even if it's not true because, Gettysburg happened, but it is one of the reasons why I admire Lee to this day. I love how he defended his home state, and it just shows how your small town will always come before serving a large corporate army like the Union. Lee is also known as a great gentleman. As someone who grew up in the South, I have heard countless stories of Lee being the definition of a Southern gentleman. Literally, I have a Southern Fried Cotton shirt that has the phrase, a true Southern gentleman, with a picture of Robert E. Lee. In fact, Lee actually wrote an article called The Definition of a Gentleman. In his article, Lee writes, and I quote, "The gentleman does not needlessly and unnecessarily remind an offender of a wrong he may have committed against him. He cannot only forgive, he can forget, and he strives for the nobleness of self and mildness of character, which impart sufficient strength to let the past be but the past. A true man of honor feels humbled himself when he cannot help humbling others." Good words, General. Yet, I kind of agree with this, but despite Lee's general attitude towards being a gentleman, his chivalry did not apply to blacks, even if they were freedmen. For instance, during the war, Lee refused terms for a prisoner exchange because the Union demanded that both white and black prisoners be exchanged. The parley went on for months, and Lee did not accept the terms until a few months before the end of the Civil War, when defeat was inevitable, so he basically had to accept any terms that the Union gave him. Moreover, Lee was also complacent in allowing his soldiers to kidnap free black farmers and sell them into slavery. Lee also called the Emancipation Proclamation a, quote, a savage and brutal policy which leaves us no alternative but success or degradation worse than death. Strong words. But History Channel guy, Lee advocated for black Confederates to fight in exchange for freedom. How can you say Lee was an awful guy when he let black soldiers into his own army? Okay, yes, that is technically true, that Lee allowed black soldiers into the Confederate army, but these soldiers did not come until late in the war, and they were basically a last-ditch effort by Lee to win the war, and most of them didn't even see combat. In fact, evidence suggests that Lee did this move with great reluctance. In a letter sent to his friend, he said, and I quote, "I should therefore prefer to rely upon our white population to preserve the ratio between our forces and those of the enemy, which experience has shown to be safe. But in the view of the preparations of our enemies, it is our duty to provide for continued war and not for a battle or a campaign, and I fear that we cannot accomplish this without overtaxing the capacity of our white population. The reality is, most black Confederates were cooks, slaves, and camp followers, and they were not armed until absolutely necessary. And no, the 1st Louisiana Color Guard does not count. They were made up of black Creoles who benefited from the institution of slavery, and in many ways they fought for the Confederacy to maintain their high status. In fact, those same supposed black Confederates immediately switched sides once New Orleans was lost to the Union. Part 3. Post-War Lee. Lee after the war is an extremely interesting case study because, on one hand, Lee did an extremely commendable thing, which was not continuing to fight a guerrilla war, which many in the South would have had him done. But because Lee did not continue fighting for years to come, he set the precedent at Appomattox Courthouse for other generals such as Joseph E. Johnston to stop the fight. Lee single-handedly allowed for the country to start to heal, and even when he was brought projects to start the Civil War again, he always declined them. Another great thing that showed the unity that Lee was providing for the country was when he visited his former adversary, Ulysses S. Grant, in the White House when Grant became president. Lee also became the president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee University, and his time at the college, he improved the curriculum so Washington and Lee would become one of the nation's premier colleges. Lee did incredible things at Washington and Lee, including enrolling Northern students, and he personally ensured that they were treated well on his campus. This was a propaganda machine, as newspapers showed Lee as the main reconciliator between North and South. Despite Lee being angered by the result of the Civil War, Lee was quiet about his criticisms towards the Union. According to historians, Lee felt the way the country was going was wrong, but there is nothing he could do about it considering the Confederacy gave their best effort in the fight, and they just lost to a superior force. Lee did such an excellent job of hiding his disgust that many of his peers thought that he changed his opinions on equal rights for blacks. Some evidence of this is Lee supporting the free education of blacks after the Civil War and consistently expelling students from Washington and Lee if they committed violent acts against blacks. This is where the idolization of Lee started to take place, as Southerners wanted a figurehead that they could look up to in the name of Southern pride. I honestly was in this category until doing research for this video. I always thought Lee gradually changed his views after the Civil War, but this is sadly not true. After the war, Lee told a congressional committee that freed blacks were, quote, not disposed to work, and did not possess the intellectual capability to vote and participate in politics. My God. But it actually gets worse. Lee also told the committee that he hoped Virginia would find a way to get rid of the blacks, either through the United States or some other means like the American Colonization Society. As mentioned previously, Lee was not active in politics after the war, but he was a strong advocate for Andrew Johnson's approach to Reconstruction. Lee particularly liked how Johnson abandoned former slaves to the political mercy of their former owners. On countless occasions, Northerners pled with Lee to denounce the atrocities going on in the South, particularly with the KKK and other hate groups intimidating freed blacks and preventing them from expressing their constitutional rights. Yet, Lee remained silent. In many ways, like leaders such as Stonewall Jackson, Lee benefited from dying soon after the war. Lee died in 1870, and this is where you see Lee become admired by the masses. As one writer said, quote, he was a public officer without vices, a private citizen without wrong, a neighbor without reproach, a Christian without hypocrisy, and a man without guile. He was a Caesar without his ambition, Frederick without his tyranny, Napoleon without his selfishness, and Washington without his reward. My God, it's like he's talking about Jesus Christ himself. I digress, though. This admiration of Lee did not end with random historians and Southerners. It actually seeped down to Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had a picture of Lee in his office. Like everyone, Eisenhower admired Lee's character and courageous nature. However, an interesting thing Eisenhower cites about Lee is how he, quote, believed unswervingly in the constitutional validity of his cause, which until 1865 was still an arguable question in America. Which is kind of a fair point by Eisenhower. There are a lot of ambiguity for the Civil War to whether it was constitutional or not for a state to secede from the Union. To many states, they believed the Union was malleable, and a state had the right to leave if the United States did not work in the state's best interests. It was not until 1869, with the Supreme Court case Texas v. White, that seceding from the Union officially became illegal. Moreover, it was not just Lee's persona that people admire. Military fanatics have also written extensively about Lee's battle tactics. Some of Lee's tactics are still studied today in American military academies, and some were implemented as late as World War II. This has led many people to state that Lee was one of the greatest generals of all time, which any Civil War military historian can easily debunk. Like, seriously, guys, he wasn't even the best general in the Civil War. Gotta love Grant. I'm sure you guys have other ones that you like as well that are better. I don't know. I can't digest who's the best general, but Lee certainly was not. This now leads me to the great question I want all of you to consider after watching this video, though. Obviously, General Lee is not a black or white historical figure. He's not good, nor is he just completely bad. There's a lot of ambiguity to his character, and I don't know whether or not he should be considered a good man or not. On one hand, I love what Lee stands for to Southerners today, but I also understand the perspective. If you're an African American, this man literally led the army to keep you enslaved. In my opinion, I don't think Lee should be canceled because, to me, he's just now a sign of Southern pride, which is his figurehead right now. But simultaneously, I do feel we need to stop pretending that Lee was an abolitionist and an early civil rights hero, because as you can see by the evidence provided, he clearly was not. So basically, don't cancel Lee, because he's frankly accomplished a lot compared to a lot of Confederates, and Lee was a lot more progressive than them as well. I know that that's a very low bar, being more progressive and not being a total bigot over Confederates, but you have to give him some credit considering where he lived and the time period he lived at the time. Anyway, don't cancel Lee. And if someone tries to tell you to rename Washington Lee University, or they want to tear down a statue like they did in Richmond, show them this video so they know the full story of Robert E. Lee and what he means to one side of the aisle and what he means to the other. Because frankly, we could know both and not have to take down his statues. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. If you want any more specific in defense of videos, just recommend them to me. I will try to get them out ASAP. I think I might start doing other Confederate figures over the next couple of weeks, and those will include Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, maybe Sherman. But at the same time, I don't want to steer away from always going over Confederates because I don't want to be the YouTuber who defends Confederates. I really would prefer not to have that persona. But if you guys have any other ideas, Mary Antoinette was one I thought was pretty funny that when I was doing research I could read about, but honestly, no clue. Just remember to like and subscribe for more content. It really helps the channel out and really motivates me to get videos out. I've been trying to get a video out every other day this summer, and I have a full-time job, and I am going to summer school, so this has been a real pain. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Bye.